Three, two. Hello and welcome to episode 5 of our podcast series, The Path to Wellbeing in Law, an initiative of the National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing. I'm your co-host, Chris Newbold of Alps Malpractice Insurance, and our goal here is simple: to introduce you to cool people doing awesome work in the space of lawyer well-being, and in the process, build and nurture a national network of well-being advocates intent on creating a culture shift within the legal profession. I'm joined by my incredible tag team partner, Bree Buchanan. Bree, welcome.
Thanks. How are you?
Good. And today we're going to turn to a critical element of well-being, of the well-being picture, and that's judicial well-being. So often when we think about well-being, we think about it through the lens of practicing lawyers under the guise of lawyer well-being. But today we're going to look at the judge side of the equation, and we have a recognized leader in our space and a fellow member of the National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing, Judge David Shaheed of Indiana. Bree, would you be so kind to introduce our guest?
Absolutely, I'd be delighted, and I'm truly honored. Judge Shaheed is just such a wonderful person that I've gotten to know over the past, 6 or 7 years, and he's a delight to work with. So let me introduce everybody to him. Judge Shaheed is a judge in the Marion Superior Court, Civil 1. He came into that position in August of 2007. Prior to that, Judge Shaheed presided over their Drug Treatment Diversion Court and Reentry Court. He served on the Court Alcohol and Drug Programs Advisory Committee and was former chair of the Problem Solving Courts Committee for the Judicial Conference of Indiana. In addition to serving on the Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program in Indiana, he's a former member of the ABA's Commission on Lawyers Assistance Programs and former co-chair of the Judicial Assistance Initiative for COLAP. Judge Shaheed, welcome. We're so glad you're with us today.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, Judge Shaheed, I think one of the things we love to do with our guests is just kind of an introductory question, which is what brought you into the well-being movement? Were there experiences in your life or other drivers that kind of led you to have a passion for this kind of work?
Yes, well, I think it's, for most people, at least in my community, there's always been somebody in the broader community, not in my immediate family, that struggled with issues of depression, sometimes with substance use problems. So I knew firsthand how difficult that could make life for a person, the human dimension to the story. And so when I became a judge and was assigned to a criminal court, and then also had the opportunity to work with our drug treatment diversion court, and then later was able to start a reentry court for ex-offenders. It was a way to take life's personal experiences and build on those personal experiences to hopefully change the lives of people that I came in contact with in the courts.
Terrific. And Judge Shaheed, we heard in our last couple of episodes from the author of the lawyer research study, Patrick Krill, and then we heard from the author of the law student research study, David Jaffe. And so now we're rounding out the third leg of the three-legged stool, and hearing from you about the critical research that's been done in the sphere around judicial stress and resilience. And you've been at the center of that national research project. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, well, that research associated with the National Task Force, as most people may remember, it had a number of recommendations, and one of those recommendations is that there be a survey of judges, especially with respect to stress, the effects of stress, and also with respect to resiliency. There had been a survey with respect to law students. There had also been a survey done with respect to lawyers. So it was one of the key recommendations, especially with the judiciary, that there be a survey of judges dealing with and also resiliency.
So what was the purpose of the research? What did you all set out to find?
Well, the purpose of the research was to actually get involved with judges and try to determine the sources of stress, the effects of that stress, and then also to have a positive part, not just talk about the things that were going wrong and things that were difficult, but also to get feedback from judges as to techniques or tools that they were using to try to deal with that stress. We know that when people are stressed out, when people are suffering from difficulties related to their work, sometimes there are unhealthy habits that take hold. And so since wellness is an important topic across all professions, and the legal profession is also a part of that, the resiliency part with respect to what judges are doing in a positive way to deal with wellness and to deal with stress in a positive way.
And
Judge,
that was,
go ahead, Bree.
yeah, that was a coalition of groups. Who all was involved in
Yes.
putting forth getting that project together? Because it was a big one.
Yes, it was a big project. And probably the principal researcher, the person that I listened to the most, the expert, was Professor Swinson. He is with the St. Scholastica College in Minnesota. And also another Minnesota contact was Joan Biebelhausen, who is the executive director of the Minnesota Lawyers Concern for Lawyers program in Minnesota. Yourself as of COLAP during that period of time. And then also Catherine Yetter, who is with the National Judicial College. They're perhaps premier organization associated with the education of judges. They put on many programs for judges throughout the year. And they had the role and associated with having their judges that participate in their programs to respond to the survey so that we had good results. There are over 18,000 judges across the country, and we were fortunate to have over 1,000 judges. In fact, 1,034 judges participated in our survey.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a great response.
Yes, very good. Yes,
very good. Yeah, I'm curious what some of your key findings were, and from your perspective, were there anything surprised you in the findings?
Well, the resiliency part, the resiliency activities, interests, those were probably something I hadn't really suspected when we initially thought about the survey. It's obvious you want to quantify as best as possible the sources of stress. So there's a ranking of the sources of stress, 137. And then also the effects of stress. There are about 34 effects of stress that were listed. But then there were also about 13 activities or interests, including meditation, walking, exercises that judges are relying upon to effectively deal with stress in a positive way.
And Judge, I've read the research and I helped out on that some.
Oh, yes.
And the thing that struck me was it seemed that judges overall, compared to lawyers, generally were faring a little bit better than lawyers. But was there anything in the research that caused alarm?
Yes, two things. It was not a percentage, but 2.2%, and the figure kind of sticks out in my mind because you have to remember there were over 1,000 participants in the survey. But of that number, 2.2% had considered suicide. In other words, the stresses of the job were so significant that they had actually considered suicide. So to me, that was a big concern. And then also one of the, we all know about the availability of alcohol in our society. And so about 9.5% of the judges, especially in 2019, identified problematic drinking as one of the effects of stress. And actually the 9.5 is a little higher than what is found in the general community of people over the age of 25, because it's around 6%. It's a little higher for lawyers, but the 9.5 is still kind of problematic when you consider the stresses of the job and that some of our colleagues in the judiciary are using alcohol to kind of cope with the stresses of their work.
Right, and that is concerning, absolutely. I remember another thing that was found out of the research was that there was data gathered of what judges were doing to improve their resiliency and what they wanted to know more about. And we looked at that gap there, and where there was a big gap between what they were doing and what they wanted to do. We were thinking about honing in on that. Can you talk about a couple of those practices or things that judges wanted to do more?
Yeah. Well, one of the troubling, I'll just mention two, for a new judge, because becoming a judge in the US, especially a trial judge, I'll just speak of that, in most states involves an election of some type. And so it's not like in Europe where they have a kind of a track or where you are a solicitor or whether on the bench. But in the US, the judge, it typically comes from the lawyer ranks. And so there's no real training to become a judge, So that's a concern, especially for new judges, because they feel ill-equipped for the task of being a judge. They don't really feel that there is the proper kind of support to help them be successful. And judges kind of work in a silo. And so there's a lot of, in a practice group, in a law office, there's always a senior associate or partner that you may be able to go to. So you're kind of on your own with respect to that. But another aspect that we have found to be helpful is the judicial roundtables. There's an excellent report out of Texas about the success of the roundtables. They started for the most part in New York because they've had a lot of success with roundtables. But the roundtables are just an opportunity for judges to get together and talk about the work that they do, not so much in terms of cases and case law and statutes and procedures, but mainly about the work itself and how you cope with that work, how you deal with that work. So that's an important part of the discussion as well.
Absolutely. And just one more thing. When will the study be published? When can we expect to see that?
Yeah, the study is going to be published in the ABA Professional Lawyer. We're in the process now of ABA review. I think for many who are aware and familiar with the American Bar Association, it's quite a bureaucratic institution. And so we're in the process of their completing their review, but we're hoping to have it published in the Professional Lawyer of the ABA by the end of the year.
Judge, and one of the things I think is interesting, particularly for any of our non-lawyer listeners, is just how differing all the different types of judges that are out there.
Oh,
right?
yes.
I mean, when you really think about the breadth of the judiciary,
right?
I mean, you got municipal judges and justices of the peace, right?
Yes.
You got district court judges, you got you got appellate
Yes.
judges, you got
Right.
specialty court judges, right? And so I'm just curious on your perspective of whether there are, my sense is that there are certain types of, of positions on the bench that are more prone to the stress and the interaction with clients. And, obviously the kind of the higher you go up on the appellate side, probably the less interaction you have
Right.
with real people. And so, I'm just kind of curious on whether the findings of the report or your personal experience kind of tend to steer toward judicial well-being being more of a challenge in certain parts of the judiciary.
One of the concerns, and it's talked about in the literature, and it's also found in the research, is secondary trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder, and we tend to associate that with combat situations, and our service people who are in military situations, but trauma can be experienced in a variety of ways. We know that there is trauma that children experience. If they're in a household where there's domestic violence, that's a trauma. If they see violence in the family, that's trauma. So that kind of drama and trauma that is seen in the family situation sometimes bubbles into the courts in cases of abuse or neglect. And there are judges that have to look at the probable cause. They have to look at reports with respect to how children are being mistreated and abused. And cumulatively, seeing that kind of information on a daily basis, a daily diet of abuse and neglect, takes a toll on the individual. Also, we're familiar with criminal courts where there are absolutely horrific events that take place that cause the loss of life or the injury to people or the assault of individuals. And again, judges have to hear that information, sometimes have to see horrific scenes that are part of the evidence associated with the death of a person. And so that's just part of the job. And so a daily diet of that kind of information eventually takes its toll on a human being, takes a toll on a person. And so one of two things happen. A person sometimes becomes numb to what they're seeing, and that can, so they kind of become somewhat detached. In other words, the daily diet of that kind of information just numbs an individual so they see it, but then they kind of block it out. And that's not good because then they become almost robotic in terms of doing the technical parts of the job. But to those who are a part of that court system with that kind of judge, they notice that there's something missing, because that's not a good thing. And so one of the other parts, one of the other aspects that causes problems for the judiciary is burnout, because after so long, a daily diet of that kind of information causes one to just burn out. And so they start pulling away from the job, the job satisfaction goes down, and many of them are just looking for an exit or a way to get out of that kind of court. I can recall recently elections in my county where I heard stories about one judge who was really kind of suffering from burnout in a criminal court. Basically just started continuing cases because he knew that he was going to be leaving the court at the end of the year. So there became about a 6-month backlog of cases that got continued. And so for those individuals who were trying to have their cases resolved, they basically suffered because the judge was burned out. So those are just a couple of ways that it manifests itself when judges are kind of overwhelmed by the ugly side or the ugly aspects of their job.
Yeah, and it seems like such an interesting challenge, right? Both on the front end, right? Because you're elevated out of the lawyer ranks, right? You're elevated to the bench, and there's got to be a shock to the system, right?
Yes.
At that point, right? Of just,
right.
What am I doing? You know, you're kind of trying to figure this out. There's all these new emotions that are coming your way. So it's not like there's a, you know, there are schools. We know that there are schools that try to help judges kind of adapt to that, but there's real emotions there. And then, as you said,
right.
on the back end of the career, you know, you kind of suffer the burnout side of things, where just as you kind of figure it out, you start to then kind of go down the road of just, you know, this is just being tough, right? And
yes.
So it's such an interesting, you know, as you think about it from a, you know, I'm at an age right now, and you know, soon approaching 50, that a lot of my friends are elevating to the bench, and a lot of times you elevate to the bench and you kind of go into an island a little bit, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's another aspect you've really touched on, and that's the isolation, because we're collegial people. One of the things that has been pointed out by the pandemic is that in many places in the world, people have become familiar with the idea of quarantine. And we have learned, you know, most of us at least, that that's not really a comfortable idea to just isolate yourself. And we've been told as much as possible we should isolate ourselves. At my age group, that's pretty much the mantra, you know, for anybody over 60, isolate yourself, don't be in contact. And so it's a little unnatural, because we like to be in community, we like to be able to interact with people. And so one of the downsides of becoming a judge is the isolation, because the collegial aspect of life, when you're in a practice group, or when you're with a law firm, or when you're with any kind of legal work in an organization, you can ask for advice. You can just kind of bounce ideas off people, sometimes about cases that you have. But when you become a judge and you have your own caseload that you're responsible for, it's not like you can go to another judge and say, hey, look, I've got this case, what do you think I should do? Because for the most part, they have their own caseload, and so you don't want to seem weak and not up to the job. So you basically go to your office or on the bench, you try to figure it out as best you can. But it is an isolating proposition. And so that takes its toll as well. And it's not like you can go home and share the details of your troublesome caseload with your family. And so it's a rather lonely job. And then when you have to make monumental decisions, life-changing decisions about people, typically those are made by yourself. It's not like you take a committee vote. You have to make the decision, and then you have to live with the decision, both with respect to appeal, but also with respect to the emotional toll that it takes on yourself, and then thinking about the consequences of your decision on the lives of other people. So it's a weight that doesn't go away, and it's a weight that is unlike a lot of other professions, especially in the legal profession.
Yeah, certainly feels like a heavy weight of a job from an emotional perspective,
yes,
right? Just a lot of weight on those shoulders. And
yes,
again,
it is. Yes,
obviously, you know, glory in the role, but you know, real world, real family ramifications in both the decisions and the contemplations. Let's take a quick break here. Hear from our friends at ALPS, and I'd like to kind of come back on the conversation and talk about why the judicial system should be paying close attention, not just to the judiciary,
absolutely,
but also the totality of the profession more generally. So let's take a quick one.
Welcome back, everybody. We're here with Judge David Shaheed, who is a member of the National Task Force and a member of the judiciary, and he's talking to us about well-being among the judiciary in the United States. And Judge Shaheed, you know, I think particularly with the task force report, we're really starting this well-being movement across the country, and a piece of that is for the judiciary. Could you talk a little bit about why the judicial system should be paying attention to well-being? What happens when well-being is not really addressed?
Well, the role of the courts in our life in America is one of the most important roles that there are. I mean, just the number of TV shows that focus on judges, you know, in terms of reality shows, and then also drama, you know, that involve the courts. There's always been a fascination with the courts, and the rule of law in a very serious sense is probably one of the hallmarks or most significant aspects of our democracy. And so most people don't spend their lives in courts. We have professionals, of course, you know, lawyers and judges and so forth, but the average person may not ever get to a court. But if they come to a court, that is going to be an experience that they seldom forget. And so the interaction that they have with the judge is going to mark them and influence what they think about the courts and the rule of law in America. So we want everybody to be at their best. You know, when we go to a doctor's appointment, we want the doctor to be at their best. Any kind of interaction that we have, we want the person that we're interacting with at their best. And since judges are making life-changing decisions, the wellness of those judges is an essential concern for all of us. And we know that if judges are well, their decisions reflect that. A part of the study has shown that with research that depending upon the time of day that judges make the decisions, they're more positive in the early parts of the session and they kind of trail off toward the end. But we want to have judges at their best during that entire process because that forms what the average citizen thinks about our courts and about our judiciary and about this principle of justice, of being fair to everyone that comes before the courts. And so the rule of law and the administration of justice through the courts is one of the hallmarks of our democracy, and that's the reason why it should be of concern that we have judges who are well and healthy on the bench.
Wow, that's a great answer. I've never heard it put so clearly in such dramatic terms. That's great. And now, of course, we are in the midst of a pandemic. We're hitting the sixth month of this.
Yes.
And you're still presiding over cases in court. And
yes.
What is it like right now in the judicial system to try and carry on justice during a pandemic?
Yes. Well, you know, since late February, early March, everybody's life all over the world has changed. And the courts and judges are not immune to that. For a period of time, basically from March, maybe until mid-May, there were basically only emergency court hearings, and definitely not hearings where people were coming to court. In many cities, in many communities, the courts have been, for the most part, closed, and they're gradually starting to open up. And so just like we're on a Zoom call for this podcast, the courts have been using Zoom primarily, at least in Indiana, as the primary mechanism to have non-emergency hearings. And so that has been a tremendous change, because two quick points about this for judges. The second source of stress for judges is heavy dockets. And so when you consider that for 2.5 months almost, there were no court activities at all, there's a backlog that has developed in the criminal courts and civil courts all throughout the court system. And so I can tell you right now that judges are stressing about how are they going to get all that backlog worked down. And so, so that's one concern for judges, and that adds to stress. The other part is that judges like routine, all of us like routine. And so within a short period of time, all of us as judges have had to become familiar with the technology of operating a court, for the most part, electronically. In most states, there is e-filing, which helps somewhat. But for the most part, judges have had to adapt, and their staffs have had to adapt to the technology associated with conducting a hearing remotely, where the judge is in one place, maybe in one location, in one state, and then the parties may be in other states or at least in other locations, and still the business of the court has to get done. So this adjustment causes additional stress, because we know how to do things the way we did them in 2019, but the reality is the way we operated as judges in 2019 is not the same way we're operating as judges in the middle of or toward the end of 2020. So those kind of adjustments are additional stressors, as they say, but that's the reality of the work that we're doing.
Yeah, change, right? I mean,
yes, absolutely.
Backlogs and new technologies and new ways of operating a courtroom. I am curious, Judge Shaheed, as you think about, the courtroom, I think your answer was so eloquent, I think, on the role of the judge. You also preside over the totality of the courtroom, right? And
yes,
that includes the attorneys that are before you, who
yes,
ultimately
yes,
are officers of the court, right?
right.
And I'm curious on your perspective with respect to them and what you generally see in the courtroom. When you see hints of attorneys who are before you who might be struggling in terms of either
Yes,
stressful situation,
yes, right.
We've even seen instances of alcoholism in courts and strange behavior. And I'm just kind of curious on your perspective on the interplay between your role on the bench and then those officers of the court, and kind of what role you have in terms of both identifying challenges and then being part of the solution.
Well, I can remember over the drug court in Marion County, an incident where a lawyer who showed up for a hearing had cocaine drop out of his pocket before he was able to get into the court. So that part was easy, because he ended up getting arrested right there in court before the court session started. But sometimes you see impairment. A judge wants to have a fair trial. In particular, if you're over a criminal court, you have to be concerned about the defendant having a fair trial, because from two respects. You want to have a fair trial because you don't want to have an appeal based upon the lawyer representing the defendant not being effective, but also from the standpoint of fundamental fairness. You want to make sure that as much as possible there's an equal playing field, and both sides, or all parties, are being properly represented. And so it does create a problem, an immediate problem with respect to how you get through that hearing. But then there's another ethical problem for you as to what you do when you witness signs of impairment. Fortunately, in all states, there are lawyers' assistance programs. And so those lawyers' assistance programs are a vital asset to the legal community, because if you see kind of a sign of impairment or something that doesn't look exactly right, and many times lawyers, you've seen them over not only months, but over years. And so you can call the Lawyers Assistance Program, mention what you have observed, and then the Lawyers Assistance Program can reach out to that profession, to that lawyer, or sometimes that judge. And through volunteers, I've done it myself, just check on the person and say that, you know, you're just there to see or to ask them if everything was okay. And again, that's one of the real benefits of lawyers' assistance programs. And that's so that judges or any other professional can alert the lawyers' assistance program in their state that there may be an impairment, or there may be some other kind of issue that is interfering with that legal professional's performance of their professional duties.
We should note that Judge Shaheed is an active leader in the Indiana Judges and Lawyers Assistance Program, and again, yes, thank you for your contributions there, because I think your perspective is particularly important. You know, let's maybe wrap it up with one final question, Judge Shaheed, which is, you know, overall, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic about, you know, judge resiliency and the ability to cope with the stressors of the bench? Obviously, with the pandemic going on right now, what have you seen? Where do you think we are now, and where do you think we're going?
Well, let me give a plug, a formal plug for the article that's going to come out this year, Stress and Resiliency in the U.S. Judiciary, Stress and Resiliency in the U.S. Judiciary. That represents, I think, a milestone or a high watermark with respect to information that will guide, in particular, those judges who are presiding judges over their courts, are those judges who are administrators for the judges in their district or circuit, so that they have concrete information from which they can kind of tailor programs to kind of assist the judges. Without the data, it's kind of hard to have a justification to have a wellness program for the benefit of judges in a district, for example. But with this report coming out, once it becomes public, then those presiding judges, those chief judges of those districts can say, now I have information that can guide me to start a roundtable for judges on a monthly or quarterly basis, or to have programs on wellness. So it gives judges and the judiciary the kind of tools and information necessary to help promote and support the wellness of judges across the country.
Wonderful. So well said.
It is. I mean, it's such a, and when that report obviously is published, we'll make sure to include that on our link at lawyerwellbeing.net, because I think that is, you know, again, a really important part of the equation, that we talk about yes, lawyer well-being, but it really is more of a holistic look at well-being right, in law, right, more generally. And we certainly, you know, thank you for your contributions, your leadership, your perspective. It certainly feels like awareness is a big part of the game right now for,
yes, very much,
for judges. Yes. And with awareness brings, you know, vulnerability, support right, amongst each other, and those all seem to probably, you know, if it seem to kind of put us more in a sense of we're trending in the right direction than the wrong direction.
Yes, Yes, well, trending is very important. We've learned with social media, and trending in the right direction with respect to wellness for lawyers, the legal profession, and also judges.
Yeah, well said. And again, thank you, Judge Shaheed, for your contributions.
Thank you so much.
This was a great conversation. Again, I think sometimes we don't step back and take a look at the role of judges, and just again what tough jobs those are.
Yes,
what important jobs they are for that. Again, are the underpinnings of a well-functioning democracy, but they don't come without emotional and stress and real problems that affect real people. And so we appreciate your perspective and bringing it on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for launching this podcast. I know it's going to be a big help to the legal profession. And so it's not a small step, it's a significant step. And we just need to support it as best we can. Years from now, people will look back on this moment and say they can remember when Chris and started this. And so so you'll be in the Hall of Fame of judicial wellness.
That's right. Well, again, thank you so much. And
Sure,
we'll be up in a couple of weeks where we start to look at, I always think of states as laboratories of democracy, right? And one of the states that has been really doing some incredible work is the Commonwealth of Virginia. And we're going to have a couple of the leaders of Virginia come in and talk about some of the great work that's happening there on well-being in law. And so stay tuned for that. Thanks, Judge Shaheed.
All right. Thank you. Thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
All right.